Will you be tweeting differently once you board the Air Force One?
No, that's other people that do that. I don't. I'm very consistent. I'm a very stable genius.
Some kind of a test, an acuity test. And he said there actually is, and he named it, whatever it might be. And it was 30 or 35 questions. The first questions are very easy. The last questions are much more difficult. Like a memory question, it's like you'll go person, woman, man, camera, TV. So they say, could you repeat that? So I said, yeah. So it's person, woman, man, camera, TV. Okay, that's very good. If you get it in order, you get extra points. Okay, now he's asking you other questions, and then 10 minutes, 15, 20 minutes later, they say, remember the first question? Not the first, but the 10th question? Give us that again. Can you do that again? And you go person.
Trump has spent decades telling people he's a genius, not just smart or capable, but a full-on genius. He's called himself a stable genius, a very stable genius, and has repeatedly insisted that he's extremely smart. So Jimmy Kimmel decided to see just how many times Trump has actually said things like that, and the result turned into one of the most talked about segments on his show. Kimmel's team went all the way back to 1987, when Trump first told a national TV audience that he had an exceptionally high IQ. From there, they dug through campaign rally transcripts, TV interviews, archived broadcasts, Truth Social posts, old Twitter posts, and pretty much every public statement where Trump chose to praise his own intelligence.
In all fairness to the former president, is that true? Do you have to use a teleprompter when speaking about President Trump? Just kind of riff on your thoughts on him.
Yeah, he's so stupid. Look at the lame, inane things that he said. He's so stupid, he can't even say anything clever or smooth. He's a moron.
After going through decades of material, they came up with a final count of 847 separate times Trump claimed or praised his own intelligence. When Kimmel put that number on the screen, the studio audience went completely quiet. Hearing someone say something like that once might come across as confidence, but hearing it 847 times made it feel much less like a personality trait and much more like a clear pattern. Kimmel didn't stop with the total, either. He organized every one of those statements into a detailed timeline, and what it revealed was something no one had ever measured this clearly before.
They said nobody gets it in order. It's actually not that easy, but for me it was easy. And that's not an easy question. In other words, go back to that question and repeat them. Can you do it? And you go, person, woman, man, camera, TV. They say, that's amazing. How did you do that? I do it because I have like a good memory, because I'm cognitively there.
Trump's repeated claims about being a genius didn't just happen at random. They showed up in a consistent, noticeable pattern, coming back again and again under surprisingly similar circumstances. The first major spike happened in April 2011, just 2 weeks after the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where Barack Obama spent several minutes making pointed jokes about Trump in front of the nation's political and media elite.
Donald Trump is here tonight. Now, I know that he's taken some flack lately, but no one is happier, no one is prouder to put this birth certificate matter to rest than the Donald. And that's because he can finally get back to focusing on the issues that matter. Like, did we fake the moon landing?
Obama joked that with the birth certificate issue finally settled, Trump could now focus on the things that really mattered, like whether the moon landing was fake. In the 2 weeks after that dinner, Trump referred to himself as a genius 22 different times across interviews and public appearances. Those statements came across as if confidence was being used to fill the space where people would normally expect evidence. The second major spike happened in January 2018, just 3 days after Michael Wolff's book claimed that White House staff described Trump as someone who struggled to focus, rarely read, and even privately called him an idiot. Rather than directly responding to those claims, Trump reacted in a different way. Over the next 72 hours, he publicly called himself a genius 14 separate times, including the now famous stable genius tweet, followed by another post where he doubled down and called himself a very stable genius. Another noticeable spike came in July 2020, about a month after Trump drew widespread attention for repeatedly mispronouncing the word Yosemite during a live appearance. According to Kimmel's research, the next 30 days included 41 different moments where Trump publicly praised his own intelligence, his brain, his natural talent, and even his genes. 41 responses following a single public mispronunciation made the pattern hard to ignore. Each time public attention shifted toward questions about his intelligence, the number and intensity of his self-praise seemed to rise right along with it.
You know, we've been hearing so much about these cognitive tests he keeps acing. You guys know what ACE means? Okay. All right. And I've offered him the opportunity to take the test live on television. He still hasn't gotten back to me on it. So in the interest of fairness, and also to get a sense of what he keeps babbling about, we got in touch with a doctor who gives this test regularly.
You know, the first question is like, what is this? And they show a lion, a giraffe, a fish, and a hippopotamus, right? And they say, which is the giraffe? So that's the only question. But what happens is it then gets harder.
Kimmel never told the audience what they were supposed to think. He simply put the graph on the screen, and the peaks lined up almost perfectly with moments of public embarrassment, business setbacks, or renewed questions about Trump's mental sharpness. For anyone who grew up believing that people with real confidence usually don't feel the need to constantly announce it, the timeline seemed to tell a very different story. It looked less like confidence and more like something that needed to be reinforced over and over again. After hearing the same claim repeated hundreds of times across decades, it started to sound less like reassurance for everyone else and more like reassurance for the person saying it. Kimmel then went back to what he called the earliest recorded example, a 1987 appearance on Larry King Live, where Trump unexpectedly interrupted a conversation about a real estate project to tell Larry King, completely unprompted, that he had a very high IQ. The conversation wasn't about intelligence at all, but he brought it up anyway. From that 1987 interview through his second inauguration 37 years later, Kimmel's team counted 847 public statements about Trump's own intelligence. As the years went on, those declarations became more frequent, and the constant repetition ended up raising more questions than it answered. Kimmel also pointed to a separate but related claim, Trump's long-running insistence that he had been a top student at the Wharton School of Finance and someone his professors recognized as brilliant from the very beginning.
Highly educated. I went to the Wharton School of Finance. I went to the Wharton School of Finance. I went to the Wharton School of Finance.
I went to the Wharton School of Finance. I was a very fine student.
I think it's fake news. But if he did that, I guess we'll have to compare IQ tests, and I can tell you who is going to win.
Kimmel never told the audience what they were supposed to think. He simply put the graph on the screen, and the peaks lined up almost perfectly with moments of public embarrassment, business setbacks, or renewed questions about Trump's mental sharpness. For anyone who grew up believing that people with real confidence usually don't feel the need to constantly announce it, the timeline seemed to tell a very different story. It looked less like confidence and more like something that needed to be reinforced over and over again. After hearing the same claim repeated hundreds of times across decades, it started to sound less like reassurance for everyone else and more like reassurance for the person saying it. Kimmel then went back to what he called the earliest recorded example, a 1987 appearance on Larry King Live, where Trump unexpectedly interrupted a conversation about a real estate project to tell Larry King, completely unprompted, that he had a very high IQ. The conversation wasn't about intelligence at all, but he brought it up anyway. From that 1987 interview through his second inauguration 37 years later, Kimmel's team counted 847 public statements about Trump's own intelligence. As the years went on, those declarations became more frequent, and the constant repetition ended up raising more questions than it answered. Kimmel also pointed to a separate but related claim, Trump's long-running insistence that he had been a top student at the Wharton School of Finance and someone his professors recognized as brilliant from the very beginning.
We've been hearing so much about these cognitive tests he keeps acing. You guys know what ACE means? Okay. All right. And I've offered him the opportunity to take the test live on television. He still hasn't gotten back to me on it. So in the interest of fairness, and also to get a sense of what he keeps babbling about, we got in touch with a doctor who gives this test regularly, was willing to take, or asked to take, by the way. These cognitive exams, they're about as difficult as the maze on the back of a box of Captain Crunch, but he's still very proud of his performance.
Kimmel ended the segment in a surprisingly quiet way. Instead of finishing with a big joke or a dramatic closing line, he simply set the chart aside and left one number on the screen: 847 claims made over 4 decades, with each spike appearing just after the kind of public criticism that seemed to trigger it. His point was never really to prove whether Trump was or wasn't intelligent. It was a much simpler observation. People who are widely recognized as genuinely brilliant usually don't feel the need to constantly say it themselves. especially not hundreds of times over several decades. As of the segment's airing, Trump had not publicly responded to Kimmel's count. Afterward, Kimmel's team released its full methodology and source material online, making the entire timeline available for anyone who wanted to look through the data themselves. The pattern stayed there, unchanged, and sometimes the most effective thing you can do with a public figure's own words is slow everything down enough for the pattern behind them to become impossible to miss. What made Kimmel's approach stand out wasn't just the total number, it was what he did after revealing it. He didn't rush to the next joke or quickly change the subject. Instead, he left the number on screen for several extra seconds, giving the audience time to really think about what 847 separate claims over nearly 4 decades actually meant. That pause mattered because it made the moment feel less like a comedy bit and more like a statistic, and viewers responded to that shift. Clips of the segment spread quickly online, not because of one specific joke, but because people kept sharing the graph itself. The timeline clearly showed when each spike in Trump's self-praise happened and what public event came right before it. Even people who never watched the full segment could understand the point just by looking at the chart, because seeing declarations of genius repeatedly increase after public embarrassments told its own story without much explanation. Political analysts and commentators quickly picked up on that approach, saying Kimmel had applied a research-style method to something usually treated as late-night comedy, looking at public statements the way a data analyst might study any measurable pattern. Some media critics said it reflected a broader shift in how comedy shows criticize public figures, relying less on personality-based jokes and more on documented patterns that let audiences reach their own conclusions from verified information instead of exaggerated punchlines. Others argued that reducing years of speeches and interviews to a single number risked oversimplifying a much more complicated record, since not every statement carried the same context or importance. That debate became part of the conversation too, with people arguing not only about Trump's repeated declarations but also about whether this style of comedy-based fact-checking was a fair way to present a public figure's rhetoric over time. No matter where people stood, though, the data Kimmel presented remained documented and traceable, drawn directly from Trump's recorded interviews, transcripts, and social media posts rather than second-hand descriptions. That distinction mattered to many viewers because every claim included in the final count could, in theory, be traced back to a specific date, platform, and quote in Trump's own words. In the weeks after the segment aired, several other outlets conducted similar reviews, comparing Kimmel's timeline with their own archives of Trump's public statements. While the exact totals varied depending on the method used, they generally reported the same broader pattern, repeated self-praise appearing most often around moments of public criticism. That consistency gave the segment even more staying power, turning what could have been just another viral late-night clip into an ongoing conversation about the relationship between public criticism and self-promotional rhetoric, one that continued to show up in political commentary and social media long after the original broadcast.
Colleges and the college board not to release his grades or SAT scores. In 2011, Trump challenged President Obama to release his academic records, and then someone called Trump's high school and demanded they find and bury Trump's transcript. So I would bet Trump's grades were so bad he couldn't even get into Trump University. But
Kimmel never told the audience what they should think. He just put the graph on the screen, and the pattern spoke for itself. The biggest spikes lined up almost perfectly with moments of public embarrassment, business setbacks, or renewed questions about Trump's mental sharpness. For anyone who believes that truly confident people usually don't feel the need to constantly remind everyone how confident they are, the timeline seemed to send a very different message. It looked less like confidence and more like something that needed constant reinforcement. After hearing the same claim repeated hundreds of times over the course of decades, it started to sound less like reassurance for the audience and more like reassurance for the person saying it. Kimmel then went back to what he described as the earliest recorded example, a 1987 appearance on Larry King Live, where Trump unexpectedly interrupted a conversation about a real estate project to tell Larry King, completely on his own, that he had a very high IQ. The discussion had nothing to do with intelligence, yet he brought it up anyway. From that 1987 interview through his second inauguration 37 years later, Kimmel's team counted 847 public statements about Trump's own intelligence. As the years went by, those declarations became more frequent, and the constant repetition began raising more questions than it answered. Kimmel also pointed to another related claim, Trump's long-running insistence that he had been a top student at the Wharton School of Finance and that his professors recognized his brilliance right away.